The Reckoning, Book 1. The Anointed Angel Comes. Prologue. Harry fucking Moss. When Private Harry Moss ran from the demons at midnight on Good Friday of 1917, he regretted every cigarette he had ever smoked in his young life. His mother warned him they would steal his wind, but Harry did not believe it for a single minute. In primary school, he was the fastest boy in his class, and as a winger on the local youth rugby side, he used that speed to score a record number of tries. It still stood, as far as Harry knew. Harry latched on to the tobacco habit even then, just for fun with the lads, and never noticed any ill effects. But truth be told, he did not start pursuing smoking in earnest until he was working on the railway. Shoveling coal was an absolute shit job. The one worst vocation he could think of was digging the foul crap out of the ground to begin with. So, secure and desolate, in the knowledge that shoveling coal into the coal cars at London Bridge Station was likely to be his life's work, he threw in his lot as a full-time, professional-grade smoker with the older men in the yard. After all, it did not seem that running fast was going to be an important aspect of his existence again. That is, until the Great War broke out. Unfortunately, by that point, he was so horribly addicted that if he did not smoke before the rouse was sounded in the morning, calling the men to formation, he would have a full migraine coming on before they were released from drill and ceremony for breakfast. His internal clock learned to awaken him 10 minutes before the rouse was blown, so he had time to roll up and suck down his first cigarette before the day officially began. Harry had dropped his rifle, somewhere between Bert Thomas and the Abbey. Perhaps thrown was a better description than dropped. Both his arms were pumping now for speed, and he saw the lot from his flashlight dancing up and down on the ground in front of him. His boots were pounding the earth, and his heart was racing. He heard the rat-tat-tat of its timpani in his ears, but it was his charcoaled lungs that were killing him. They ached from the strain, and he felt as if he was drowning, unable to pull in enough oxygen not just to keep his pace up, but to keep him living and breathing. As he turned the corner behind the Abbey, a stream of his mates, with their rifles at port arms, double-time passed in the opposite direction. Bringing up the rear were two of his best pals, Tommy Winters and Kevin Bergen. "Oi, what's the story, Harry?" Kevin hollered as they jogged past. Harry pulled up short, hands on knees, sucking wind. He pointed to the field, where another rifle crack sounded. The two words Harry found tumbled out. "Something's coming!" Kevin and Tommy had known Harry from childhood. Top boy at school, not one to fuck about, brilliant on the rugby pitch, not some chicken-livered bastard. This had all been Harry's big idea to begin with, and he never shirked a day. They all joined up together in 16, when the government's big enlistment sales pitch revolved around the PALS brigades. Lord Kitchener himself guaranteed that if you joined up with your pals, you could serve together in the same unit until the war was won. Easy peasy. It was a damn effective, horrible idea. Harry and Tommy and Kevin and John and other Tommy had all joined up together, and it was a total lark at the start. The girls went stark crazy for the fresh-scrubbed, clean-shaven local boys who, for the most part, were wearing their first ever new clothes. Even Tommy, with the beginnings of his beer belly, looked the part of the dashing young infantryman. The uniforms, food, and cigarettes were all 100% free, and they gave you money. Not much, to be sure, but a shilling a day worked out to buy plenty of beer. And yes, the instructors screamed and hooted and raged until they were red in the face, and there was a lot to remember about how to stand, how to salute, how to march in proper order for what seemed days on end. However, there were rifles to shoot, straw dummies to stab with bayonets, wrestling to be done with the other lads, and rugby matches between the companies that Harry and Tommy and Kevin and John and other Tommy absolutely dominated. 3 months later, they were in the trenches, and they were in for it. On 1st of July 1916, Harry and Tommy and Kevin and John and other Tommy roared over the top as the Battle of the Somme commenced. By noon, the British Army had suffered 60,000 casualties in their PALS brigades. Because the PALS were fighting in the same units and the bloodbath was so deep, it stood to reason that entire towns lost all their men in one morning's work. Deeply regret to inform you telegrams went to nearly every house in those quaint little villages when all of their fathers and sons and brothers and cousins and nephews ended up not waking at the rouse and reporting for roll call on 2 July. Harry's company was luckier than those, but their list of the fallen included John, who got shot in the sternum as he came out the trench. He died in Kevin's arms with a sucking chest wound. It was like he was drowning underwater. But he weren't. He was right there on dry land. Maybe it was like a fish fields on the docks, Kevin later said, somberly, after all his tears had been spent. Other Tommy got hit by a burst of shrapnel. He was so disfigured that they all agreed maybe it was not even him as they stared at the remains later on. Harry could not get over the fact that an ear was missing. The grotesque visual stuck with him. Plenty of other things were gone too, which made him unrecognizable as their other Tommy. Yet here was that full head of curly brown hair on the yellowy white skull. It looked a great deal like other Tommy's coiffure. But that absent right ear had been sheared clean off, as if some skilled butcher had applied a very sharp meat cleaver to it, and the ear's absence made the corpse look utterly alien. After all, other Tommy definitely had 2 ears. So how could this be him? They did their best to promote the idea amongst themselves that maybe their other Tommy had been captured by the Jerrys and was now sitting out the war in Berlin. Perhaps this was some other poor, bloated, dead, earless bastard. Inside, they all knew better. After the Somme, Kevin was ready to go home. It had been Harry Moss who sat him down when he found him packing a bag and convinced him that if he ran, or tried to shirk, or declared himself a conchi, a roundly detested conscientious objector, it would get field treatment number 1. Tied up to a wagon wheel, in range of the German guns, was no way to get yourself killed. Kevin spat back. Drowning on dry land and getting smithereens by shrapnel bits is no bloody fucking way to get yourself killed either. Harry finally talked him down and told him that if he played it smart, he could have some control over whether he lived or died. Do the bare fucking minimum, right? Whenever possible, do fucking nil. Always keep your head down. Don't ever be the first out of the trench when we hop the bags, and never volunteer for anything that could be dangerous, Harry told him. Calmed, Kevin realised Harry was right. There was no running away from the grand machine that was the British Army. He recognised with glaring clarity that his only choice was to stay and soldier on by doing as little soldiering as humanly possible. So when Harry came tearing around the corner of the Abbey, running in the opposite direction of the rifle fire, Kevin and Tommy took heed. Something's coming! Harry got one good breath of air in, and then the image of the monsters coming across that field hit him in the heart again, and he ran. Harry did not wait to see if Kevin and Tommy were following. He heard their boots hitting the ground behind him, as he led them through the camp and into the meadow, heading fast toward the refuge of the thick woods beyond it. The forest was not 20 yards away when things started to go tits up. Harry's foot caught on something in the meadow, and it sent him sprawling. It was astonishing how quickly the ground came up to meet him. His flashlight bounced away, its beam strobing and tumbling until it rolled to a stop. Harry tasted blood in his mouth, from where his teeth had sunken into his lower lip. He rolled over, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He told himself that it was not any worse than a hard, open-field tackle on the pitch, and he began to shove himself up off the turf. Kevin and Tommy were 20 metres away when he went down, hustling after him but nowhere as fleet of foot. The flashlight landed pointing straight back toward them, so at first they could not see it. But Harry could. The thing that had tackled Harry Moss was an odd pair of hands reaching out of the furrowed ground. As Harry watched those hands and the arms connected to them pressed up from the earth, revealing the torso of a British infantryman covered in dirt. He got his elbows out, then used them to start levering himself out of the sod. When Kevin and Tommy saw him, they came to a dead stop. "What the hell is going on, Harry?" Tommy cried. The dirty infantryman turned at the sound. It moved with a speed that was hard for the mind to comprehend, hitting Tommy with brutal ferocity, striking with its fists and elbows and knees like some kind of animal. It stunned him with a headbutt to the bridge of his nose. The popping cartilage sounded like a stick being snapped in two. As Tommy fell to the ground hollering, it surged for his neck with its teeth. Kevin grabbed hold of it by the back of its shirt, putting all his weight into trying to pull it off of Tommy, but the beast would not budge an inch. Tommy began to scream. Out of the darkness, something cracked Kevin in the mouth, and he lost hold of the shirt tail. He heard his head strike the ground as he flapped back to the turf. He was stunned for a brief second, stars and pain in his vision. It was not the first time he'd been cold-cocked in his life. Plenty of bar brawls had gone that way, and knowing that Tommy was in real danger, spurred him up off the ground, looking for whoever had done him on the blind side. 3 other dirt-covered infantrymen were now with them in the field. Kevin saw movement all around, where the moonlight was cutting through the darkness bright enough to cast shadows. He had a funny thought. All the dead men he and Tommy had planted that afternoon had ripened and now seemed to be harvesting themselves. Kevin kept his fists up, was on the balls of his feet like a Marquess of Queensberry featherweight fighter, backing up in the ring as his opponents took his measure. He was shaking now, and he felt tears welling up in his eyes. In his periphery, he saw that Tommy had stopped moving, and that the thing on top of him, satiate, was leaning back. It stood. As the dead men continued clawing their way out of the earth around him, and as the nearest ones, with their matted hair and bright eyes shining out of dirty faces, began to close on him, a plaintive voice came out of Kevin's throat, echoing Tommy's last words. What the hell is going on, Harry?" But Harry Moss was gone. As he entered the woods, Harry heard Kevin cry out, and then a distant "No, no, 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 no," that erupted into a high-pitched scream. For a gossamer sliver of time, Harry wanted to stop and turn. A voice in his head demanded it, demanded honour, demanded courage, demanded self-sacrifice. But sheer terror had the upper hand, and no amount of willpower could overwhelm it. He plunged ahead because he could not go back. He made his bed when he ran from the fight in view of Sergeant Thomas. To return to the fray would mean death from any side he encountered. To fly with every ounce of his being was to escape, to live. So as our ancient ancestors ran from Vesuvius its embers falling all around, igniting the forests of oak and chestnut, its piles of ash coming to bury, burn, and suffocate them, their pumping legs the one distant hope for survival. Harry Moss ran. Brambles tore at him, tree limbs smacked him in the teeth. Out of nowhere, he ran head and shoulder first into the trunk of a tree. It stunned him and broke his collarbone cleanly. He shrieked in pain as he fell to the ground. In the blackened forest, all he saw was stars dancing in front of his eyes. He pressed up to all fours and tried to stand, but the concussion had taken his balance. As he straightened his spine, he took two dizzily random half steps to the left, tripped over tree roots, and landed painfully on top of them. When he sat up, she was there, waiting. Her great grey head was perhaps twice as big as Harry's. Her yellow eyes caught the only light in the woods and reflected it back into Harry's own. Her canines bared, and for the briefest millisecond, Harry read the act as a smile. Then she snapped forward and locked those smiling teeth under his chin. In a final defense of his courage, Harry did not go meekly. He punched and kicked and gouged and tried to twist away despite the pain of her bite. But she was immune. She held his neck in her mouth tightly and squeezed until he finally stopped thrashing. When she felt his blood stop pulsing, she let him drop, a bag of bones and delicious muck. But she did not feed. She sat back on her haunches and watched, temporarily slaking her need by licking his blood from her fur. She did not wait long. Harry Moss bolted up as if a charge of electricity had been shot through him. His mind raced, and a torrent of memories flowed through Harry's brain that never did and never would belong to Harry Moss. It recalled the sound of howling from the dark, while the tribe huddled by the fire, sharpened wooden spears at the ready. They saw the clash of a phalanx and a slow-motion crushing death on the Grecian plains, caught between the bronze and hide shields of Ionians and Miletians, who pressed against each other in the thousands, turning to pulp any man caught in their human vice grip. He heard the Roman trumpet sound, the pounding of the master orator on his drum, felt the smooth, braided coil of the leather lash in his hands as the long ship bucked in the waves, and the slaves put their whip-scarred backs into rowing. He felt the crash as the ship took the ramming broadside, the chaos as the chained slaves went under, the terror he felt as his bronze armour dragged him down, down, down into the azure Adriatic waters. A creaking gallows in Westphalia that failed to break his neck and swung him back and forth for long, desperate minutes to the delight of the crowd. The arrows from the English longbowmen piercing his steel placket and breastplated cracy as if they had been made of crepe paper. The guillotine's whoosh, the joy of the unwashed masses, and the powdered wig that his decapitated head watched tumble away in the breeze. Scalped and left to die on the American plains, raped and gutted in the Khyber Pass, bayoneted at Shiloh, a Zulu spear in his belly at Isandlwana. All his memories of well-earned horror and more flowed through him. When they reached conclusion, he rose up. The she-wolf watched it all, and then she turned, disappearing into the woods, looking for more men to prey upon while the night was still young. Chapter 1. Good Friday. In a cramped little bunker beneath the Canadian front-line trenches, 24 hours before Harry Moss began his new chapter, another young man readied for what figured to be his last. At 28, Lieutenant David Durant looked a decade older. God damn, but he was tired. Fatigue was understandable. The road he walked that brought him to this juncture had not been a particularly easy one. Each step along the way had taken its pound of flesh and led directly to this moment, seated at a small desk next to his loss-ridden cot, using shaving soap and a straight razor to attack the last of the stubble on his neck. He'd come to journey's end, all signs pointing to the end being precipitously nigh. Tired was the fucking understatement of the year. Durant took a deep breath and focused on not slitting his own throat. Wisdom said that someone else would save him the bother, and soon. In the distance, the concussion and rattle of the big Canadian guns, careening shells into the German lines, created a steady underpinning of rumbling vibration, a summoned storm on the not-too-distant horizon, meting out a molten steel hell on earth. The bass note of the distant explosions trembled a kerosene lantern hanging from struts that made up the roof. Its light illuminated walls of corrugated tin and thin pine planks shored up by wooden beams. A haphazard handful of shelves had been applied to the construction, and they now bore a smattering of useless personal effects and other bits and bobs. A six-shot Webley revolver dangled in her polished leather holster from a nail tacked into the wall. As Durant paused to wipe a line of soap scum from the razor, his eye caught and stayed for a long moment with the pistol. Its Damoclean weight pulled the belt taut. A ridiculous thought occurred to Durant. The sidearm suddenly seemed to bear a tremendously outsized weight, a weight that, should a little iron nail fail, would wrench the pistol from the wall, through the mud floor, and down, 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 lancing through crust, lithosphere, asthenosphere, mantle, and outer core, the weight of its sins banished into the fires of Earth's roiling iron heart. Durant shrugged off the momentary fancy. The pistol was not the one carrying weight. When the war had come a-calling, he let it sweep him up in its bloodthirsty embrace and carry him here to this moment. The army, by its very nature, had relieved him of any need to actively choose his own course. But inside, he knew he could not just chalk this shit show up to flag and country. He looked in a hand mirror at a face he did not recognize as his own, and thought of all the rather poor choices he had made that brought him to this precipice. He was walking the razor now, and the next step was definitely going to take him right over the edge. He had no one to point the finger at but his own sorry self. Seated on a stool behind Durant was his senior officer, Major Charles Stanford. Chuck could not for the life of him recall being as uncomfortable as he felt at this moment. Chuck was, after all, a polite gentleman Canuck from Ontario. His London-born parents had settled on the lake just south and west of Toronto proper in 1887. Chuck's people still carried themselves with the apologetic attitude of territorial subjects of the king. But Chuck, in a turn that would shock his mother, had begun to question that fealty. His recent experiences leading a Canadian regiment at the mercy of British High Command had begun to give him second and third thoughts on the wisdom of subservience. Fortunately for his mum, second and third thoughts were the apex of his capacity for rebellion. He would remain a good son and subject until his dying day, which, unfortunately for Chuck, was coming soon. Blissfully unaware of that fact, he watched his junior officer shave and absently played with the buckle on the shrapnel helmet in his lap. "So, the regiment's ready to move out?" said Chuck, apropos of nothing. Durant nodded. The artillery rumbled distantly. The stubble on Durant's neck succumbed to the straight razor. Chuck chuckled a little too loudly. You're just a bundle of nerves, aren't you there, eh? Durant's returned smile did not hold very much in the way of mirth. There was no humour or bravado beneath it, just a settled resignation. He knew what was coming, and he knew there was nothing he could do now to stop it. So he just carried on with his shave. When Chuck spoke again, it was with marked sadness, and the underlying sentiment was genuine. I admire you, David. I hope, under similar circumstances, my attitude would be the same. Durant finished shaving his throat. Yes, sir. He'd come through the ordeal unnicked. I imagine it would. Chuck took what comfort he could from Durant's assessment of his courage, whether it was true or simply kind. What can't be cured must be endured, Chuck said. That refrain was one of his dimwit father's cherished favorites. He took his old man's flask out of his jacket. Taste of home? Durant glanced at the tarnished silver affair. Nothing to lose. Sure. Chuck pulled beat-up tin cups from the makeshift shelf. He had been longing for this moment. A little anesthesia could not possibly hurt. He twisted open the flask, emptying its contents into the pair of vessels. I've had supply double the rum ration for your boys, before things kick off, you know. Durant accepted a proffered whiskey. He sipped. It was surely fine stuff. Better for their morale than my well-groomed moustache. Chuck's laugh was loud and hollow. There was a distinct embarrassment underneath it. Well, can't let our standards slip, eh? Chuck drank deeply. The alcohol did not warm or comfort him as he had hoped it might. He ran his fingers through his thinning hair. It had been thick and black in 1914, but 3 years on, what was left of it was lank and grey. He looked like a scrawny version of his goddamn bald, stiff upper-lipped English bulldog of a grandfather. He sighed, and the alcohol loosened the seditious truth. These British bastards. Levee breaks and we're their little Dutch boy, jamming up the hole with our pinky fingers in a bale of barbed wire. He looked up at Durant, embarrassed by his own honesty. Sorry. Durant shook his head, dismissing the apology and any need for it. Chuck stared into his tin cup with the brown spirits. I guess I should say, you are their little Dutch boy. Durant had another taste of Chuck's Stanford Club whiskey. It was definitely the good stuff. What can it be cured? Durant said. Chuck Stanford smiled and laughed weakly at the echo of his father's impotent aphorism. He scratched at his scalp and rubbed at the headache that was developing beneath it. I don't need to tell you this, but I feel it's my duty. When he got to the pith of it, he could not quite look at Durant. Hold at all costs, hold until relieved, or to the last man. Durant knew what was coming. He did not plan on faltering. Yes, sir. He finished his whiskey, then wiped the last remnants of shaving soap from his cheeks. Chuck pressed on. He found it was easier now that he had begun. Stick to your guns. Come hell or high water. If we can move the regiment safely, we'll be back to relieve you. Durant cleaned the razor. He had the dawning realization that what Chuckles was here for was to give benediction and receive absolution. The whiskey had served as a reasonable benediction. Unfortunately, absolution was not Durant's to give, so he gave Chuck the best response that he could. I understand. Durant's statement did not absolve Chuck's oncoming headache. It actually made it throb a little worse. So Chuck finished his portion of the whiskey, hopeful that the alcohol would relieve him of the need to be absolved. Alas, it did not. For a moment, as he felt the featherweight of his empty flask, he regretted sharing with a dead man. Quick as he could, Chuck banished the thought. Bad form, that. Chuck stood. The only words that came to the forefront of his brain seemed simple and ludicrous, but they came out anyway. Good luck, Lieutenant. Major Stanford saluted Durant crisply. To his great joy, the detachment of the formal gesture did more to absolve him of responsibility than the whiskey had. The salute passed responsibility back to God and duty and honor and country. 4 words that Chuck would have had a fair amount of trouble defining if anyone bothered asking him what they actually meant. Durant returned the salute. They regarded each other for a moment. In that breath of time, Chuck went cold. All his momentary joy sucked away. He felt stripped naked, full certain that Durant was taking in all that there was of him, and he knew Durant saw, engraved at the foundation of Chuck's earnest care and sentimentality, were 9 simple words. Thank fucking Christ, it ain't me in your shoes. The shame of that revelation rushed through Chuck. He did not say anything more. There was nothing left to say. Chuck grabbed up his shrapnel helmet. He ducked through the blackout curtain, heading quick into the cover of the trenches and the darkness of the night.